But I would argue that that's one of the most dramatic ways in which tourism could benefit the economically poor, is by the creation of employment. And all-inclusives in that regard occupy an interesting space, since all-inclusives, if they end up by being all-inclusives, employing more people to buy services which might otherwise have been traded by small employers locally, may actually have a significant pro-poor advantage through the creation of employment for people who were perhaps previously in the Gambia, for example. People who are currently bumsters, beach boys, tell me that what they'd really like is jobs in the resorts, doing the kinds of things that they do with tourists now in terms of providing sporting opportunities and so on, which they do in the casual economy. They'd rather have full-time jobs doing that, as would I if I was in their situation. So I think there are opportunities there. And then there's philanthropy and volunteering, which I want to acknowledge but not want to talk about today. Pro-poor tourism was about enabling the economically poor to be the main beneficiaries of tourism. One of the problems with many of the initiatives which have taken place and many of the projects is that they focused on general sustainable tourism and rather lost their focus on the economically poor. There's very little evidence from most of the big programs that have taken place that the focus has been on the local economically poor. And unfortunately, that means that we've not been very successful in demonstrating the net benefit to the economically poor. I say net benefit because in general tourism has some negative impacts on some parts of economically poor communities. We have to take into account any negative impacts. We have to look for what the net benefit is. We haven't been very good at doing that, partly because we haven't collected the data. And I understand why people doing projects don't want to collect the data. It's quite disturbing that you might find that you've not had a positive impact on the economically poor as a result of your work and the spending of a great deal of money. I've been in that situation. It was one of the worst couple of months of my life while I waited for the evaluation to be done of the work that we'd done in the Gambia. And it's very difficult as you do that work to know whether the result will be positive, neutral, or worse, negative. I can well understand why people shy away from it. And unless development organisations and the donors demand that that evaluation is done, it will not be done. There has to be pressure from the people donating the money for it to be done. I place a lot of emphasis on this because without collecting that data, without knowing whether the initiative has been successful or not in its objective of taking some people out of poverty, we can't know whether that approach works or whether it's worth replicating. And I don't think we can expect to continue to be funded to do it unless we can demonstrate those net benefits. I speak with some passion about this because I wrote the first paper on tourism and poverty reduction, or elimination, as Diff insisted it be called, in 1998. We took that to CSD7 in 1999, and in 2002, it went to the World Summit on Sustainable Development, and I was delighted when UNWTO took it up and created the STEP Foundation, very important initiative. But we've been talking about this since 1998. Since 1998, Diff has decided that it no longer does tourism. The Dutch development organisation SMV no longer does tourism. It closed it down. If, in all honesty, I think we've mainly gone backwards over the last 12 years. What are the top 3 challenges then? I was asked to restrict it to 3, so I've obeyed the brief. I think probably the single biggest mistake has been the failure to engage with the market and with the private sector. And I agree with what Richard was saying this morning, that there's a massive disconnect. People go and talk to the private sector when they've got something to sell, not when they're constructing the product. And then they're surprised when the private sector is unable to sell it. That's a great waste of money. I personally don't care that much about the money. A lot of aid money gets wasted anyway. But very often the community has donated its time for free, and sometimes the community is left in debt by an NGO or consultancy firm that walks away, having been paid for its work, but leaving the community with a white elephant, something which will never repay the debt that the communities got into. And I know of examples of that in Peru, for example, which I find quite disturbing, but also in the Himalayas. Second big challenge is to engage poverty reduction in the mainstream of what we do. It's all very well to have a series of initiatives on the side of the big developments that occur in tourism. But in reality, the reduction in poverty needs to be part of the master plans developed by the development banks. Very often, they are not. I remember seeing a very late draft of the master plan for the Gambia, one of the world's poorest countries. Poverty was not even mentioned in the final draft of that. When it finally was published, it was in, but that was because people had put their own time to write into that master plan poverty reduction. The consultants had not put it there. And that's the same with the governments and with the development agencies. And the third thing I'd say is that we need to work really hard at minimizing the risk to the communities. We've heard talk this morning about shared risk and shared reward. Well, the reality, I think, very much is that it's often the community who bear the risk and who do not see the rewards. And we have to stop doing that, particularly the donors and the banks need to be very careful that the risks are not borne by the most vulnerable, and the people who do the work need to be really careful that the economically poor are not left with mortgages on their farms or with debts that they cannot repay, risking being left in a worse situation after the initiatives than they were before. So what would be my three main recommendations? The first, that donors and program managers demand impact data. You need to know what the actual impact of these initiatives is, not what the outcomes were or the outputs. It's not about how many projects. It's about what the actual impact was on poverty for particular people. We have to be able to demonstrate that the money we're spending on pro-poor tourism achieves more than just trickle-down. Trickle-down happens anyway. We have to be able to prove that we're doing better than that. To do that, the beneficiaries need to be defined, and we need to be able to measure how much we increase their living standards through the initiative. Now, I've had that argument with many of the practitioners whose work I've had I was going to say the privilege, but it'd be more accurate to say the pain of evaluating. And the reality is that there are lots of reasons why you will say you can't do that. None of them are really valid. The fact that you can't measure all of the beneficial impacts doesn't mean that you couldn't measure some of them. There's a lot of flight from doing it. The second thing, and again agreeing with Richard, we need to place far more emphasis on securing market access for the economically poor. We know, for example, that the practice in the Gambia of having free market days, which are the days when the hotels invite local craft producers to sell within the hotel boundary, makes an enormous difference to the earnings of the economically poor. It's a very simple, relatively easy thing to do, makes a real difference to the living standards of the economically poor. We should be pushing for that kind of initiatives. And there are many others I could mention. But the third thing we need to do is to remember that the risk for people comes very often from engaging in some totally new livelihood strategy. Many of the best pro-poor initiatives that I've seen have been as a result of looking at the way in which a community makes its living now and supplementing that income by enabling them to sell something to tourists, whether that's a coffee farmer on the slopes of Kilimanjaro doing a coffee tour on 12 Monday afternoons a year and earning from that nearly half of what he will earn in a year, or whether it's someone showing people around a rice farm or taking people to have tortillas in their own home. There are lots of ways in which people can make a significant additional income, often enough to take them out of poverty and into a better form of subsistence than they had before, with very little risk because you're not destroying their existing livelihood. You're actually adding to it rather than taking something away. The major successes that I've seen have largely been in the private sector. It's not a set of products. It is rather an opportunity for the private sector to use tourism to reduce poverty. I say that the examples are more in the private sector than elsewhere because we see the evidence for that in the Responsible Tourism Awards, which we hold every year. We're seeing very detailed data now coming down through from private sector companies which demonstrate the impact that even low margin businesses can have on poverty in a particular area. We've seen Thomas Cook, for example, one of my former students has just recently been in the Gambia developing a whole new destination experience with groups of economically poor local people. Again, a supplementary additional income with a guaranteed market of the sort that Richard was talking about. That is the benefit of designing the product alongside the company which would then take responsibility for the sales. In the world that I live in, partnerships mean shared risk and shared rewards. Tour operators and hoteliers can do a great deal simply by mentoring and providing a market. What I think is unacceptable is where either the private sector or an NGO or a consultancy firm or a donor increases the vulnerability of the poor by encouraging them to get into debt or requiring them to give up labour to create a lodge for which they will never receive any income. We need to be very honest about that. That's actually exploiting the economically poor for the advantage of the consultants and the NGO who are undertaking the project. We need, I think, to place a lot more emphasis on creating opportunities and capturing the value. But we need to enable the economically poor to capture that value. The value cannot all be captured by the private sector. Most of all, I think it's about accessing markets and removing barriers. But that is much easier to do for the economically poor in destinations around tourism than it is to do for groups of economically poor producers who may otherwise need to export their goods and services to developed markets, whether those are in the developed countries of the north or whether they are in the cities of developing countries. There's much more opportunity to work with the economically poor and to bring them adjacent to more developed markets where you have people close to the place of production. So we need demonstrable success. We need beneficiaries definitely to be the economically poor rather than the consultants and the NGOs. We need to be able to demonstrate that we can deliver poverty reduction and make a difference to the Millennium Development Goals. We need to be able to identify and replicate good practice, but without measurement, we cannot identify good practice. We can only tell ourselves comforting stories. We can only demonstrate success with data. And we need that data to convince donors and governments and the private sector to engage. We need more demonstrable benefits. Without them, we won't be able to replicate and scale up. And we need to do more than implementing a few projects. We've got a conference coming up in Sao Paulo immediately before Rio Plus 20, where I hope that we'll be able to explore what's worked and what hasn't in development aid since Rio and since WSSD in 1992. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Harold, for this rather also critical review of what we always call pro-poor tourism, and really asking, are we doing the right thing? What are doing also we as development agencies? We come to the next speaker now, which is Mr. Marco Allegre. He is the founding member of the GIA Group, which is an NGO based in Peru that does environmental projects in several Latin American countries. Mr. Allegre is also the director of the National Cleaner Production Center in Peru. He's going to give us a few concrete examples on green jobs creation and tourism in rural tourism development. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation to talk about green jobs in tourism. And I think, or I expect to complement both previous presentations, and based on our practical experience in few projects in this field in Peru. Peru, as you know, is in South America, is a developing country. Despite Bill Gates said last week that we don't need more international cooperation. We believe that we need a different type of international cooperation, maybe not the classical or traditional cooperation, a cooperation based on enterprise and a cooperation that promotes the market development. I am working in Grupo GIA. It's an NGO funded in 1992. We work in environmental education and sustainable cities and enterprises and sustainable tourism. We are member of the steering committee of the Cleaner Production Center, Cleaner Production Latin Net, and the Global Partnership for Sustainable Tourism. I'm going to talk about rural tourism. It's a quite different issue that has been presented in the morning. If you see, for me, the difference is that in ecotourism you see more landscape and natural issues, and in rural tourism you will see more faces and more people, because we are trying to include these people in a local development based on sustainable tourism. To talk about employment and green jobs, some numbers to know which is the context in Latin America and Caribbean. 50% of the employed people have an informal employment. It means that the informal employment is very huge. And 6 of 10 youth people have access to employment. They only have informal employment. Despite poverty is decreasing, the gap and the extreme poverty is still a big issue, a big challenge. What options we have to formalize, to increase, and to improve the quality of employment? Business as usual or green economy. I delete one slide here, but the transition to green economy is an opportunity, and is a different way of developing of promote developing in our countries, and is an opportunity as it has been mentioned. I'm going to talk about the conclusion of our projects, Mundo Colca, Santuario de Tocra, Vive Pachacamac, Walking with Paracacapu. These are projects that we are implementing in different Andean areas of Peru. We don't pretend, our expectation is not to create new jobs, as it has been mentioned. We provide an extra income for the people. All these people that you will see in our pictures are people that are farmers. They have fish factories. They work on rural activities, and as far as we create or we develop with them touristic circuits, we improve their income and their quality of life as much as possible. We try to introduce this different approach for increase the revenue, and also increase the quality of their products, providing technical assistance, and to introduce them to new markets like organic markets, like or to provide them new opportunities like fair trade, and to link them to other companies that have policies in corporate social responsibility. Also, we improve the quality of their habitat, the quality of the town. This is a project that we paint the houses, and we made them nicer for the tourism. We have a line of eco-gourmet. It's very easy. We just move the farmers to produce food in a high quality food that they can sell it for high level restaurants and for tourism. And we have another program with hotels that implements water savings and solid waste management as well as energy efficiency. And this is to